Hi, my name is Katie Howitt,
And I'm Morgan Mangus.
and we're the discussion leaders for this post. Today we'll be discussing the novel Sula and its impact on American culture. Sula is a novel written by Toni Morrison in 1973. This novel tells the story of two friends, Nell and Sula. These two girls live in the Bottom, a mostly black community in Ohio. The Bottom, first sold as a trick to a slave, slowly grew into a vibrant community full of culture. The story then goes into detail about both Sula and Nell's backgrounds. Nell's family is stable and believes highly in social conventions. Nell continues to question her mother's conventional ways throughout the novel. In contrast, Sula's family is entirely different. Sula lives with her mother, Hannah, and her grandmother, Ava. Both of these women are seen as crazy, and their home has 3 adopted boys and many different boarders. Despite these opposite backgrounds, Nell and Sula become best friends during their adolescent years. This friendship is abruptly cut short when an accidental drowning of a neighborhood boy, Chicken Little, occurs. Sula and Nell were involved but never told anyone about the accident. Due to this strain, the two started to grow apart. To add to Sula's despair, her mother dies due to the burns she endured from a fire. Later, after high school, Nell decides to marry and settles into a conventional role as a wife and mother, just like her family background. Sula, similarly to their contrasting backgrounds, chooses an entirely different path. Sula decides to leave the Bottom. During this time, Sula has multiple different affairs, but soon finds the same routines and people boring and returns to the Bottom. Sula does not garner a warm welcome from the town when she returns. Sula is viewed as a personification of evil due to her interracial affairs. She is further criticized when she has an affair with Nell's husband, Jude, who abandons Nell. Having Sula and her evilness around the Bottom brings the town closer together and actually allows them to live in harmony. Eventually, Nell cuts Sula off as a friend. Later in 1940, just before Sula's death, Nell and her reconcile half-heartedly. Along with the death of Sula came the death of the town's harmonious lives. Now in 1965, the Bottom is threatened with the prospect of a white golf course. Nell visits Ava, Sula's grandmother, in the nursing home. After visiting Ava, Nell is forced to confront her judgments against Sula. After the incident, Nell realizes she too quickly fell into the social conventions around her in order to label herself as a good one. At the end of the novel, Nell, in sadness and regret, goes to Sula's grave and calls out her name. During the 1970s, conflicts surrounding race and gender were very prevalent. Racism was still common and gender discrimination was normalized. Although segregation was deemed unconstitutional at the time, racism was never stamped out of the American culture. There was still a huge gap seen between the lifestyles and the demographics of white and black Americans. In addition to the prevailing racism, women were also receiving discrimination. After World War II, women were sent back to the household to provide for their families and cater to their every need. This was a reality that women had to conform to as men occupied jobs outside the home. Along with this, there was a big change from social convention to the hippie lifestyle, especially for women. Political protests were also very prevalent in the 1960s and 1970s, many of those being a big influence for Sula as well. Morrison wrote Sula in order to examine ambiguity and what the terms good and evil demonstrate. Her novel also investigates human emotions and relationships, concluding with the point that social conventions are unconventional when serving as a foundation for one's life. Another big theme is the connection between people and the place they grew up. There were also many different themes of race, gender, and confrontations between different points of view. A big reason as to why this novel is so pivotal is due to those themes Morrison touches on. All those themes apply to the world around us, especially during the time this novel was written. Another theme within Sula is the intersectionality between sex, gender, and race. Morrison includes this theme to comment on the degradation of women in society. Both Nell and Sula represent two different attitudes towards gender roles and sex, as seen by their family backgrounds. Nell chooses the conventional norm, while Sula rejects the traditional notions and responsibilities that are placed on a female. This is seen in the novel by Nell settling down and taking on those household responsibilities, while Sula leaves the Bottom and sleeps with many different men. Race also relates to this connection between sex and gender, since there are conflicts between the interracial relationships Sula has. Sula is dehumanized due to these affairs and is looked at as nothing short of evil, since she broke the standard conventions placed upon African American females due to their race and gender.
This intersectionality played a significant role in the development of the Black feminist movement. Previously, American women began exposing their hardships and unhappiness in America as seen in the feminine mystique. This was primarily supported by white American women, but did not account for the racial and sexual segregation that Black women were facing. Black feminism is established when African American women experience many situations that allow them to understand their position in sexism, class oppression, and racism. As discussed before, during the time of the publication, there was ongoing oppression of women and African Americans. Women were placed in the home, and African Americans were still aiming to receive equal justice in America. In 1973, the time of Sula's publication, the National Black Feminist Organization was founded. There can't be liberation for half a race. This organization supported the equality of not only African Americans, but also women who were experiencing injustice due to their sex and race. Sula provides the reader with insight into the struggles that an African American woman was faced with. Toni Morrison was able to successfully depict this as she was an African American woman living during this time period. She was able to develop a distinct characterization of 3 Black women. These 3 African American women all represent a different type of female. Eva represents the older generation, which provides wisdom to others. Nell demonstrates the rebel who is victorious, while Sula demonstrates an extreme rebel due to her community, which ends in loneliness and failure. The novel supported the Black feminist movement as it established a fictional example of an African American's liberation from her oppression and segregation. With support for Black feminism, the novel also demonstrates the double consciousness that African Americans were faced with during the time of its publication. Double consciousness was first described by Du Bois in Strivings of the Negro People and the Souls of Black Folk, which we discussed at the very beginning of this class. Du Bois described double consciousness as being an American living in the United States, but also being African American in one body. An individual who identifies in both of these categories was seen to be divided into these 2 psychosocial realms in America. In Sula, the reader is exposed to the double consciousness that the characters are faced with. More generally, Sula is faced with 2 conflicting cultures when she is torn between belonging to the bottom and the outside world of the white community. Sula is faced with having to make decisions about where she belongs throughout the novel. More specifically to double consciousness, Sula is fronted with the issue of her divided self by being identified as African American while also living in America. In addition to this, she is also faced with a third identity of being a woman in America. This splits Sula's consciousness into 3 aspects, and she is faced with decisions relating to this throughout the novel. Sula's rebellion from the bottom demonstrates her split identity struggle. In addition to this, she becomes an evil individual in the eyes of conformity as she becomes involved in interracial affairs. Double consciousness is a glaring theme seen throughout the novel as Sula is consistently split between her identity as an African American woman in the United States. Along with the plot of the novel, Sula provides a framework for the history of storytelling and narration in the African American culture. African American storytelling is comprised of their memory, resistance, and personal transformation. Although the novel is fiction, Toni Morrison touches on many hardships that African Americans faced. This is typical of storytelling in the African American culture, as they are exposing the struggles they faced in America. In the African American culture, some authors write autobiographies that tell of their real history. This dates back to slavery, when these autobiographies sought to expose slavery and the struggles of an African American living in the United States. Sula seeks to expose the injustice that African Americans face, specifically the segregation that still prevailed even after it was deemed unconstitutional. The bottom represented the split between the life of a Black American and a white American. In addition to this, narration in African American culture involves a form of resistance. Resistance is much seen in Sula, as she creates rebellion within herself not to accept conformity but to go outside of the norm. This is a typical theme seen in Black culture, as African Americans did not want to face oppression any longer. As stated earlier, this novel mirrored and laid the foundation for the Black feminist movement, which propelled the idea of resistance to sex and race conformity. Lastly, African American narration includes personal transformation. Typically in literature, African Americans overcome their suppression and transform into a free American individual. This demonstrates the freedom that America offers while also showing the development of equality in society today. All in all, this novel was so pivotal in America due to the development of the African American woman. It exposed the intersectionality of race, gender, and sex, while also providing an example of the intensified double consciousness that African American women were faced with. Along with this, it was an example of the life that a Black woman experienced in America during this time. Morrison composed a piece of literature that supported the Black feminist movement and developed a story that fits into the history of narration in the African American culture. In today's society, it isn't unusual to hear about different political and social movements. The movements which are most prevalent in our society today are regarding equal rights for all genders and races. Feminism has been pushed in our society since around the 1960s, and even more so today. Black feminism is a big social topic. Like Toni Morrison, many different African American authors and celebrities are pushing for the rights of African American women. One of the most prominent faces in this social movement is actress Amanda Steinberg. This 21-year-old actress, who many of you may recognize from playing Rue in the Hunger Games, has quickly become an icon for the new generation of Black feminism. In 2015, she posted her school project, Don't Cash Crop My Cornrows. Don't Cash Crop My Cornrows. This was a video that discussed the cultural appropriation of African American culture by white society. After this, she became an outspoken advocate for the oppression of African American women face, including sexism, racism, body shaming, and appropriation of their culture and features. So the two questions we have for you guys is the first one, Toni Morrison was well known for her feminist literature. Name another author who pushes their feminist agenda across in their work. Are the themes of feminism in their writing usually subtle or obviously prevalent in those novels? The second one, in Sula, Nell and Sula represent two different sides of the female spectrum. Which do you think most young women supported in the time it was written, in 1973? Why do you think they supported this view of a female?